The London drizzle painted the cobblestones outside the Grand Theatre a slick, shimmering grey. Ben, a 13-year-old Vietnamese boy with messy brown hair and eyes that held a depth beyond his years, huddled beneath the theatre's awning, his basket of wilting flowers a splash of defiant color against the monochrome backdrop. He'd been selling flowers, roses mostly, scavenged from bins behind fancy florists or occasionally bought wholesale with his meager earnings, ever since his mother had passed away a year ago. He didn't know his father, he was a ghost, a whisper in his mother's sad stories. The theater, with its towering columns and ornate carvings, was a world away from Ben's reality, the cramped, damp room he rented above a noisy takeaway, the constant gnawing hunger, the fear of the immigration officials he sometimes saw lurking in the shadows. Tonight, though, a sliver of that glamorous world was within reach. Eleanor Davies, the renowned event planner, was inside, overseeing rehearsals for a charity concert. Ben knew her by sight, she often swept past him, a whirlwind of tailored suits and expensive perfume, her blonde hair perfectly arranged. She was everything Ben wasn't, powerful, confident, and seemingly untouchable. Tonight, however, Eleanor looked tired. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper. Her usual brisk walk replaced by a slower, more hesitant pace. She stood near the stage entrance, talking to a tall, imposing man with silvering hair and a sharp, angular face. This was Richard, Eleanor's husband, a famous lawyer known for his ruthless tactics and impeccable suits. Ben had seen him before, too, usually escorting Eleanor to events. His hand possessively on her arm. Ben watched as Richard handed Eleanor a sleek, stainless steel thermal flask. "Here, darling," he said, his voice smooth and low, but carrying a subtle edge that made Ben shiver. "You look exhausted. Drink this, it'll warm you up." Eleanor took the flask, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She was about to unscrew the cap when Richard, seemingly distracted, turned to speak to a stagehand. It was then, in that brief moment, that Ben saw it. Richard's hand, quick as a viper's strike, flicked open a small, silver vial and tipped a few drops of a clear liquid into the flask. Ben's heart hammered against his ribs. He didn't know what the liquid was, but the furtiveness of Richard's actions, the way he glanced around to make sure no one was watching, sent a jolt of alarm through him. It was like a scene from one of the old spy movies his mum used to love. He felt the old, familiar tug of his mother's words, "Nu thay du gi sai tre. Con kong duok im lang." If you see something wrong, you must not be silent. He hesitated. He was just a flower boy, invisible to people like Eleanor and Richard. What if he was wrong? What if they laughed at him, or worse, called the police? But the image of his mother's gentle, worried face spurred him on. Taking a deep breath, Ben darted towards the theater entrance, ignoring the doorman's startled shout. He pushed past the velvet ropes and ran towards Eleanor, his voice cracking with urgency. "Don't drink it," he yelled, his voice surprisingly loud in the cavernous foyer. "He put something in your flask." All conversation stopped. Every head in the foyer turned towards him, the stagehands, the musicians, the elegantly dressed guests milling around, and, most importantly, Eleanor and Richard. Eleanor stared at him, her expression a mixture of surprise and confusion. Richard's face, however, had turned ashen, his carefully constructed mask of composure slipping for a fleeting second. He recovered quickly, a sneer twisting his lips. "Who is this child?" he demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. "Some street urchin looking for a handout? Security, get him out of here." Eleanor held up a hand, stopping the security guards who were advancing towards Ben. She looked from Richard to Ben, her gaze lingering on the boy's earnest, frightened face. There was something in his eyes. A sincerity that cut through the layers of wealth and privilege that usually surrounded her. "What did you say?" she asked Ben, her voice calm but firm. Ben swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard. He He put something in your flask. While you were talking to that man. I saw him. Richard scoffed. This is ridiculous, Eleanor. Don't tell me you're actually listening to this, street rat. He turned to the security guards again. I insist you remove him immediately. He's clearly trying to cause trouble. Eleanor ignored him. She held the flask up, examining it closely. The liquid inside looked innocuous enough. But Ben's desperate plea had planted a seed of doubt in her mind. She'd felt a strange disconnect with Richard for months, a growing unease that she tried to dismiss as stress. Could this be something more? Bring me a testing kit, she said, her voice sharp and commanding. And someone call Dr. Miller. I want him here immediately. The foyer buzzed with whispered conversations. Richard's face was now a mask of controlled fury. He tried to reason with Eleanor, his voice low and urgent, but she refused to meet his gaze. She was focused on Ben, her intuition screaming at her that this small, insignificant boy might have just saved her life. Ben, meanwhile, stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He'd done what his mother would have wanted, but the consequences were terrifying. He watched as a member of the theater staff hurried away, returning moments later with a small, white box. Eleanor handed the flask over, and the staff member carefully took a sample of the liquid. The wait felt like an eternity. The air in the foyer was thick with tension, a palpable sense of anticipation hanging over everyone present. Richard, his composure finally cracking, paced back and forth, muttering under his breath. Finally, Dr. Miller, Eleanor's personal physician, arrived, his face grim. He took the testing kit from the staff member and disappeared into a small office. A few minutes later, he emerged, his expression confirming Eleanor's worst fears. He spoke in a low voice, but everyone in the foyer could hear his words. The liquid contains a mild, slow-acting poison. Not immediately lethal, but with prolonged exposure, it would cause significant organ damage and, eventually, death. A collective gasp swept through the foyer. Eleanor swayed slightly, her hand going to her chest. She looked at Richard, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Richard, caught in the glare of the truth, his carefully constructed facade crumbling, could only stare back, his face a mask of defeat. He babbled excuses. He was framed, the test, a mistake. But no one listened. Eleanor didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes, a chilling blend of betrayal and steel, said it all. She simply nodded to the security guards, who moved swiftly to restrain Richard. He struggled briefly, shouting denials, but it was futile. The evidence was irrefutable. Later that evening, after the police had taken Richard away and the chaos had subsided, Eleanor found Ben sitting alone in a quiet corner of the theater's backstage area. He was still clutching his basket of flowers, the blooms now even more wilted. He looked small and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the brave figure who had burst into the foyer earlier. Eleanor sat down beside him, her expensive silk dress rustling softly. She didn't speak for a moment, just looked at him, her gaze filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite define. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, Ben." Why did you do it?" Ben looked up at her, his blue eyes, so startlingly bright against his tan skin and dark hair, filled with a simple honesty. "My mom, she always told me to do what's right. Even if it's scary." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. His words resonated with a painful familiarity, echoing the values she herself had tried to live by. The values she had instilled in her own son, the son she had lost so tragically years ago during a flu pandemic. A wave of grief washed over her, a familiar ache that had never truly faded. "What happened to your mother?" Eleanor asked gently. Ben's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers tracing the edges of a faded rose petal. "She died. Last year. The flu, It was bad. His voice was small, almost a whisper. Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy so intense it almost took her breath away. She knew that pain, that hollow emptiness that never truly went away. "I'm so sorry, Ben," she said softly. Do you have any other family?" Ben shook his head. "No. I don't know who my father is." Mum said, she said he loved her very much, but they had to be apart. She said he had a long scar on his left arm. That's all I know. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. A long scar on his left arm. The words echoed in her mind, a chilling premonition forming in her heart. It couldn't be, could it? Her own son, before he was lost, had often talked about his father, a man he'd never met, describing a distinctive scar on his arm, a detail she'd shared with him from a photograph she cherished. That night, sleep eluded Eleanor. She tossed and turned, haunted by Ben's words, by the look in his eyes. By the impossible, terrifying, yet somehow hopeful possibility that had taken root in her mind. She kept seeing Richard's face, his mask of civility shattered, revealing the cold, calculating monster beneath. And then she saw Ben's face, so young, so vulnerable, yet so incredibly brave. The next morning, Eleanor made a decision. She contacted a private investigator, the best in London, a man known for his discretion in his relentless pursuit of the truth. She gave him all the information she had about Richard, about his past, about his increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the incident at the theater. "I need you to find out everything," she told him. Her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. His finances, his associates, his secrets. Everything. The following days were agonizing. Eleanor threw herself into her work, trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but her mind was constantly racing, replaying every interaction with Richard, searching for clues. For any hint of the darkness she now knew lurked beneath the surface. She also found herself drawn to Ben, inviting him to stay at her large, mostly empty, house. He was hesitant at first, overwhelmed by the opulence of her home, so different from the cramped room he was used to. But Eleanor's kindness, her genuine warmth, slowly chipped away at his reserve. He helped in the garden, a sprawling expanse of manicured lawns and vibrant flower beds, a stark contrast to the concrete jungle he knew. He was a quiet, respectful presence, always willing to lend a hand, his eyes constantly taking in his surroundings. One evening, while helping Eleanor clear out some old boxes in the attic, Ben stumbled upon a dusty photo album. He opened it carefully, his fingers tracing the faded images. He stopped at a picture of a young Eleanor, beaming, holding a newborn baby in her arms. "This," Ben began, his voice hesitant. I used to have a picture just like this. My mum kept it in her purse. But I lost it, after she died." Eleanor, who had been sorting through papers nearby, froze. She turned to Ben, her heart pounding in her chest. "A picture, like this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ben nodded, his eyes wide. "Yes. My mum said, she said it was someone very important." Eleanor felt a dizzying rush of emotions, hope, fear, disbelief. She walked over to Ben and gently took the album from his hands. She stared at the picture, her own younger, happier face staring back at her. She remembered that day so clearly, the overwhelming joy of holding her son for the first time. "Ben," she said, her voice trembling. Do you remember anything else your mother told you about your father? Anything at all?" Ben frowned, concentrating. She said he was a good man, but that things were complicated. She always told me I should try to find him. She said, he was my only family left. He paused, biting his lip. And, she said he had a long scar on his left arm. The scar. The detail that had haunted Eleanor for years. It was the same detail her son, little Leo, His name was Leo, a name she hadn't dared to speak aloud for so long, used to point at with childish curiosity in the photograph. It was a detail Richard also possessed, a fact that had only registered in her mind as a horrifying possibility after Ben's revelation. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and fragmented for so long, were suddenly snapping into place, forming a picture that was both beautiful and terrifying. Beautiful because it meant her son might be alive, terrifying because it implicated the man she had married, the man she had trusted, in something unspeakably cruel. That evening, Eleanor sat alone in her study, the photo album open on her lap. Beside it lay a small lock of Ben's hair, carefully collected earlier that day while he was sleeping. She had already contacted her friend, Dr. Miller, the same doctor who had tested the contents of the flask. She had pleaded with him to arrange a DNA test, stressing the utmost secrecy. "I need to know," she had told him, her voice choked with emotion. "I need to know if this boy, if he's my son." The wait for the results was excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour, every hour like a day. Eleanor found herself constantly watching Ben, observing his mannerisms, his expressions. Searching for any resemblance, any confirmation of the impossible hope that was blooming in her heart. She saw it in the shape of his eyes, in the curve of his smile, in the quiet strength that radiated from him despite his difficult life. Ben, oblivious to the turmoil raging within Eleanor, continued to help around the house. His presence a strange comfort in the midst of the gathering storm. He told her more about his mother, about her unwavering kindness, her quiet determination, her constant refrain that he should never give up hope of finding his family. He spoke of her with a love and respect that touched Eleanor deeply, a testament to the woman who had raised him. Despite all odds. One afternoon, while working in the garden, Ben paused, looking up at Eleanor with a thoughtful expression. "My mum always said I should look for my dad," he repeated. "But I don't even know his name. She just said he had that scar." Eleanor's heart ached. Did she ever mention anything else about him? Anything at all? Ben shook his head. Just that he was a lawyer. She said he was very clever. A lawyer. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Richard was a lawyer, a prominent and successful one. The implications were staggering. Could Richard have known all along? Could he have deliberately kept her son from her? The thought was monstrous, yet, it fit. It fit with his increasing coldness, his secrecy, his desperate attempt to harm her. The phone call came late one evening. Eleanor was sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames, lost in thought. When the phone rang, she jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Dr. Miller. "Eleanor," he said, his voice grave. "I have the results." Eleanor closed her eyes, bracing herself. "Tell me," she whispered. There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched into an eternity. Then, Dr. Miller spoke, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and compassion. "The DNA, it's a match. Eleanor. Ben is your son." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming, unimaginable happiness. But beneath the joy, a cold fury began to build, a righteous anger directed at the man who had stolen her son, who had kept them apart for all these years. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, David." She hung up the phone and sat there for a long moment, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Her son. Her Leo. He was alive. He was here. He was Ben. She found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table, meticulously cleaning his flower-selling basket. He looked up as she entered, a shy smile on his face. Eleanor walked towards him, her heart overflowing with a love she had thought lost forever. She knelt down in front of him, taking his small, calloused hands in hers. "Ben," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I have something to tell you." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. You're not just Ben, the flower boy. You're Leo. You're my son. My lost son." Ben stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. What are you saying?" he whispered. My mum. She was telling the truth, Ben," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "She was protecting you. And I'm your mother. Your real mother. I've been searching for you for so long." She pulled out the DNA test results, the paper crinkling in her trembling hands. This proves it. You're my son, Leo." Ben took the paper, his eyes scanning the words, the scientific jargon that confirmed the impossible. He looked up at Eleanor, his face a mixture of confusion, wonder, and a dawning hope. "Mum," he whispered, the word tentative, fragile. Eleanor's heart soared. She reached out and pulled him into a fierce hug, holding him tight, as if she would never let him go. "Yes, darling," she sobbed. "Yes, I'm your mum. I'm here. I'm finally here." Ben clung to her, his small body shaking with sobs. He buried his face in her shoulder, the years of loneliness, of uncertainty, of longing, finally finding release. He had found his mother. He had found his home. The following days were a blur of emotions. Eleanor told Ben everything, about his early childhood, about the frantic search after he disappeared during a crowded market visit amidst the flu pandemic. Panic, about the years of grief and despair. She showed him pictures, told him stories, filled in the gaps in his memory, piecing together the fragments of his lost past. Ben, in turn, shared his own stories, about his life on the streets, about the kindness of strangers like old Mary, about the constant fear and uncertainty. But also about the unwavering hope that he would one day find his family, a hope instilled in him by his mother's enduring love. The revelation of Ben's true identity, however, cast a long, dark shadow over Richard. Eleanor, armed with the DNA evidence and the findings of the private investigator, confronted him. The scene was not the explosive confrontation she had initially imagined. Instead, it was a quiet, devastating unraveling. Richard, stripped of his power and his lies, finally confessed. He had known all along. He had orchestrated Ben's disappearance during the pandemic, exploiting the chaos and Eleanor's grief to get rid of the child he saw as an obstacle to his ambitions. He had paid a woman to take Ben and leave him in a different part of the city, assuming he would end up in the foster care system, lost forever. He had never anticipated Ben's resilience, his determination to survive, his unwavering belief in his mother's words. His motive, as Eleanor had suspected, was purely financial. He had manipulated their prenuptial agreement, ensuring he would gain control of Eleanor's company if she were deemed unfit to manage it. The slow-acting poison was intended to do just that, to weaken her gradually, making it appear as though she was losing her grip. The confession was a chilling testament to the depths of human depravity, a stark contrast to the pure, unconditional love that now blossomed between Eleanor and Ben. Eleanor handed Richard over to the authorities. The evidence against him overwhelming. He was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and fraud. His career, his reputation, his carefully constructed life, all crumbled around him. The legal proceedings were swift and decisive. Richard was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. For Eleanor and Ben, the end of Richard's reign of terror marked a new beginning. They moved out of the grand, echoing house that had been filled with so much pain and deception, and into a smaller, cozier home, a place filled with warmth and laughter. Ben started school, excelling in his studies. His natural intelligence finally given the opportunity to flourish. He made friends, discovered a passion for art, and slowly, tentatively, began to heal from the scars of his past. Eleanor, freed from the burden of her unhappy marriage and the constant fear for her life, found a renewed sense of purpose. She continued to run her company, but with a different focus, dedicating more time to charitable causes, particularly those supporting orphaned and vulnerable children. She became a fierce advocate for children's rights, determined to ensure that no other child would have to endure the hardships that Ben had faced. One sunny afternoon, a few months after Richard's trial, Eleanor and Ben were sitting in their garden, surrounded by the vibrant blooms that Ben had so lovingly tended. Ben was sketching in a large pad, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor watched him, her heart filled with a quiet joy. "What are you drawing, darling?" she asked. Ben looked up, a shy smile on his face. "It's you, Mum," he said. "And me." "And..." He hesitated, then pointed to a small, empty space in the corner of the drawing. "And I'm leaving a space for when we find her." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Find who, Ben?" The woman who looked after me," Ben said. "The one who took me from the market. Mom always told me she just followed the instructions, that she was also struggling. I want to find her, to thank her. She kept me safe." Eleanor was stunned. Even after everything he had been through, Ben still held on to his compassion, his ability to see the good in others. It was a testament to his spirit, to the enduring power of love. Even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. "We will, darling," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "We'll find her. Together." And so, their journey continued, not just as mother and son, reunited after years of separation, but as partners, bound by a shared past and a hopeful future, determined to make the world a little brighter. A little kinder, one act of compassion at a time. The flowers Ben once sold to survive now bloomed in their garden, a symbol of resilience, of hope, and of the enduring power of a mother's love.